The storm screamed like a living thing the night they found Nathan Graves. 3 knocks shattered his isolation. Not the wind, not a mistake. On his doorstep stood a woman with eyes like liquid mercury, clutching a child swaddled in frostbitten rags. "Help us," she begged, her voice ablaze against the howling dark. But the real chill came after he let them in. The jagged mark glowing beneath her sleeve, the one that meant hunters were close. By dawn, Nathan would learn 2 truths. The baby wasn't human, and the storm outside wasn't half as deadly as what followed. Before we start, please, subscribe to the channel by clicking the card button on the top right corner now, and hit the notification bell so you can get amazing daily stories as and when published. Please do comment your views about the story or any topic that you want to get a story on. We'll make it happen. Let's dive into the story. The wind shrieked through the city's abandoned alleys, cutting through the night like a predator on the hunt. Streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pavement, struggling against the relentless storm. The air carried an unforgiving chill, the kind that bit through layers and settled deep into bones. This was the kind of night where even the most desperate sought shelter, where the streets held only ghosts and forgotten echoes. Nathan Graves sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of the kitchen light casting long, tired shadows against the walls. His microwave beeped. Dinner was ready. A plastic tray of something vaguely edible. He wasn't hungry. Not really. The silence in his apartment stretched, pressing against him, heavier than the cold outside. Then came a knock. Sharp, deliberate. 3 precise raps against his door. Nathan froze. No one knocked on his door. Not anymore. He stared at the door for a long moment, heart thudding in his chest. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe the wind had rattled something loose. But then, another knock. Just as precise. Just as urgent. A knot twisted in his gut. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his mind already cycling through possibilities. A neighbor? No. He barely spoke to them. The landlord? Doubtful. He was late on rent, but not late enough for a confrontation. Someone looking for trouble? Nathan's jaw tightened as he approached the door, keeping his footsteps silent out of habit. He glanced through the peephole. What he saw made his breath hitch. A woman stood just beyond the threshold, her long black hair clinging to her face, wet with melted snow. She was shaking violently, and in her arms, wrapped tightly in a bundle of fabric, was a child. Natan's gut twisted. She looked up suddenly, her eyes locking onto his as if she sensed him watching. Silver eyes, unnatural, almost glowing in the dim porch light. Not human. Nathan exhaled sharply. His fingers hovered over the lock. This was trouble. The woman raised a trembling hand and knocked again, softer this time. A plea. Please. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Help us. Nathan clenched his jaw. His instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to turn away. Whatever this was, he didn't want to be involved. But then the baby stirred. A tiny, pitiful whimper. Something cracked inside him. Cursing under his breath, he yanked the door open. Get inside. Now. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering with something. Fear, uncertainty. Nathan growled, stepping back. You want me to leave the kid out in the cold? Move. That was enough. She stumbled forward, almost collapsing past the threshold, her grip on the child tightening as she crossed into the warmth. Nathan slammed the door shut behind her, locking it twice. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was her ragged breathing, the wind still howling outside. Then she whispered, "Thank you." Nathan exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Yeah," he muttered. "Let's see if you're still thanking me in the morning." The warmth of the apartment was a sharp contrast to the frozen world outside. The woman stood just inside the door, her body tense, dripping melted snow onto the hardwood floor. The child in her arms made a soft noise, a weak, almost inaudible whimper. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He had no idea what he was doing. He didn't let strangers into his home, much less ones carrying a baby in the middle of a snowstorm. But here they were, and now he had to deal with it. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the couch. She didn't move. Nathan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, lady, you're shaking like a damn leaf. Either sit down, or I'll have to scrape you off the floor when you pass out." Her silver eyes flickered toward him, wary, but after a moment, she hesitated forward. She moved like a ghost, her legs trembling beneath her as if they might give out any second. The moment she sank onto the couch, she curled in on herself, wrapping the child tighter against her chest. Nathan studied her for a moment. Her clothes were too thin for the weather, her cheeks hollowed from what looked like days, maybe weeks, of hunger. "Jesus," he muttered, turning toward the kitchen. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." There was a pause. Then, quietly, she said, "I haven't." That stopped him in his tracks. He glanced back at her. She wasn't looking at him, just staring down at the baby, her fingers stroking its tiny face. The way she held the child, so protective, so desperate, it made something in his chest tighten. Nathan shook it off and grabbed a can of soup from the cabinet. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could heat food. He set the pot on the stove, twisting the dial to high. Behind him, the woman shifted slightly. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if the answer was dangerous. Then, finally, she whispered, "Lena." He nodded slowly. "Nathan." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of bubbling soup and the wind rattling against the window. Nathan grabbed a bowl and a half-stale loaf of bread before setting them on the table. He motioned toward the food. "Eat." Lena stared at it like it might disappear. Then, cautiously, she reached for the bread. The first bite was hesitant, almost reluctant. But once she started, she couldn't stop. She tore through it with a quiet desperation, as if afraid it would be snatched away at any moment. Nathan sat across from her, watching. "You're not from here," he said. Lena stiffened slightly. "No," she admitted. Nathan leaned back. "You want to tell me who or what you're running from?" Her grip on the spoon tightened. A flicker of something crossed her face. Fear, regret, exhaustion. Then, finally, she met his gaze. "They're coming for me." Nathan's fingers drummed against the table as Lena's words hung between them like a blade poised to drop. "They're coming for me." The fire crackled in the background, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the ice creeping down his spine. He narrowed his eyes, studying her. "Who?" His voice was low, steady. Lena's grip on the spoon tightened. The bowl in front of her was nearly empty now, but she barely seemed aware of it. Her silver eyes flickered toward the window, scanning the darkened street beyond. People who don't like loose ends. Nathan exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. "That's not an answer." Her jaw tightened. "It's the only one I can give you." Something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just some woman looking for shelter. She wasn't just running. She was hiding from something bigger than a snowstorm. He watched her for a long moment, then leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You don't have a lot of options here, Lena. You show up on my doorstep, half frozen, carrying a kid, and now you're telling me someone's after you." He shook his head. "I don't do charity cases. If you're bringing trouble to my door, I need to know what kind." Lena's gaze snapped to his, her expression hard. "You think I asked for this?" Nathan didn't flinch. "I think you're not telling me everything." Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. The fire popped in the background, sending a soft flicker of light across Lena's face. There was a moment, a flicker of hesitation, before she slowly rolled up the sleeve of her tattered coat. Nathan's breath hitched. A mark burned into her skin. Faintly glowing, jagged symbols, like fractured veins of molten silver. He knew that mark. He had seen it before. "Shit." He leaned back. "You're a warden." Lena flinched, quickly tugging her sleeve back down, her expression guarded. "Not anymore." Nathan let out a slow, controlled breath. He had heard rumors about the wardens, those who served the order, the enforcers who hunted their own. If she had been one of them, and now she was running, "They don't let people leave," he muttered. Lena's gaze darkened. "No, they don't." Nathan ran a hand through his hair. "So they're tracking you." She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said everything. Nathan exhaled sharply. This just keeps getting better. He pushed up from his chair and paced toward the window, peering through the blinds. Snow whirled in chaotic patterns outside, blanketing the street in eerie stillness. Too still. Lena's voice was quiet when she spoke. "I didn't mean to bring this to your door." Nathan turned, pinning her with a look. "Yeah, well, intentions don't mean much when bullets start flying." A long silence. Then Lena swallowed. "If you let me stay tonight, we'll be gone by morning." Nathan watched her, then glanced at the child, still bundled tightly in her arms. The kid barely made a sound, just small, shallow breaths against her chest. He sighed, rubbing his jaw. "I should throw you both out." Lena's grip tightened on the baby, bracing herself. Nathan exhaled heavily and shook his head. "But I won't." Her eyes snapped up to meet his. Surprise flickered across her face, but she didn't thank him. Nathan pointed a finger at her. "One night. That's it." Lena nodded once. "One night." He wasn't sure why, but he didn't believe her. The storm had quieted, but inside the apartment, the tension was still thick enough to cut. The radiator hummed faintly, filling the silence as Nathan sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the sleeping bundle across the room. The baby, tiny, fragile, and far too quiet, was curled safely in the blanket Lena had spread out. Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against the far wall, eyes half-lidded but alert. She hadn't let herself relax. Not fully. Not even after the food. Not even with the fire warming the space. Nathan rubbed the back of his neck. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I haven't," Lena murmured. He glanced over. "You're not going to collapse on me, are you?" "I'll manage." Nathan leaned back with a sigh. "Do you always carry that much pride? Or is it just for special occasions?" Lena's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't nothing either. "I've learned not to expect help," she said softly. "Yeah, well, you found the one guy dumb enough to give it." Her eyes lifted. "What?" Nathan hesitated. The question hung there, heavier than it should have been. "Honestly," he muttered, "I don't know. Maybe I got tired of being the guy who walks past and pretends he didn't see." Lena didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at her daughter, still sleeping soundly. Her fingers brushed a wisp of hair from the baby's forehead with a kind of careful tenderness that didn't match the hardened edge of her voice. "She's 3 months old," Lena said suddenly. Nathan blinked. "Really?" "She was born in hiding, in a cargo hold. No doctors. Just me, bleeding and praying she'd cry." His stomach twisted. He glanced down. "She's quiet. She has to be." Her voice caught for a second, but she swallowed it down. "Noise gets you killed." Nathan stared at her. The truth of it settled into his bones. She wasn't exaggerating. That was the kind of sentence that came from experience. Raw, ugly experience. He stood, restless, and moved toward the kitchen. He poured water into 2 mugs and placed them both on the table. When he turned around, Lena hadn't moved. "You want tea or something?" "Never had it," she replied. Nathan raised a brow. "You're missing out. It's like warmth in a cup." "I'll take the warmth." She stood slowly, careful not to wake the child. As she approached the table, her posture stayed guarded, but there was something else behind her eyes now. Wary curiosity. She took the mug from his hand and wrapped her fingers around it. After a few seconds, she spoke again. "I know you're still deciding whether to throw us out." Nathan smirked faintly. "Would have done it already if I was going to." "Then what are you waiting for?" He looked at her, really looked at her, scars, exhaustion, and a strength he hadn't expected. "I'm waiting to see who you really are." Lena met his gaze, and for the first time since she'd stepped into his home, she didn't look ready to run. "Maybe," she whispered, "I'm wondering the same about you." Nathan had just stepped outside to take the trash to the alley when the silence hit him. Too quiet. Even for this part of the city, usually filled with distant sirens, dogs barking, or someone shouting 2 blocks away. Tonight, there was nothing. Just wind, hollow and cold. His boots crunched in the snow as he dropped the trash into the bin and paused. Something prickled at the base of his neck. He turned slowly, scanning the darkened street. Nothing. No figures in the shadows. No movement between the buildings. Still, something was wrong. He hurried back inside, locking the door behind him with a little more force than usual. Inside, it was calm. The heat hummed through the vents. The fire had dimmed but still burned low. He heard soft murmuring from the living room. Lena speaking in that melodic, unfamiliar tongue of hers. It was gentle, rhythmic, and meant for the baby, who cooed quietly in response. Nathan stepped into the room and leaned against the doorway. Lena sat cross-legged on the rug, rocking the child in her arms. The firelight painted her features in soft gold, washing away the sharp angles, the fatigue, the fear. For a moment, she didn't look like a fugitive. She looked like a mother, tired but grounded in that one small life she held so close. "You're back," she said without looking up. "I didn't go far. It's quieter than before." Nathan frowned. "Yeah, I noticed that too." She finally looked at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of alertness, reflexive and trained. She knew danger. She'd lived with it. "You think they're close?" she asked. He crossed his arms. "I think if they are, they'll knock before kicking the door in." Lena's arms curled tighter around the baby. "Then we don't wait." Before he could respond, there was a knock. Not a friendly one. 3 hard, deliberate bangs on the door. It echoed through the room like a threat. Nathan's heart jumped. Lena stood immediately, already moving toward the hallway. "Take her," Nathan said, pointing toward the back. "Stay quiet. Lock the door." "Who is it?" she asked. "Don't know. Not taking chances." She didn't argue. She vanished down the hall, and a few seconds later, the soft click of a door closing followed. Nathan exhaled, rolled his shoulders, and moved to the front door. He opened it just a crack and stepped halfway into the frame. 2 men stood outside. One older, with a square jaw and cold eyes. The other younger, thinner, twitchy. "You Nathan Graves?" the older one asked. "Depends who's asking. We're looking for someone." "Valari. Woman. Baby. We heard she was seen around here." Nathan chuckled, cold and dry. "A Valari? Around here? You really think one would last 5 minutes in this neighborhood?" The younger one smirked. "You'd be surprised what desperation makes people do." Nathan shrugged. "Haven't seen anything. And unless you've got a warrant, you're wasting my time." The older man stared at him, long and hard. "If you see her, you let us know." Nathan gave a slow nod, deadpan. "Sure thing." They turned and walked off into the night. Nathan shut the door, locked it, and turned around. Lena stood in the shadows. "They'll come back," she whispered. "I know," Nathan said. Her voice broke as she looked down the hall toward the baby. "If they find us, they'll take her." Nathan's jaw tightened. His voice was quiet but resolute. "They're not going to find you." Her eyes widened, something flickering inside her. And for the first time since arriving, she believed him. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He sat near the front door, eyes fixed on the lock, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The image of the 2 men lingered in his head, their posture, their tone, the way the older one hadn't blinked once. They weren't here to ask questions. They were hunting. The first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds when Lena appeared in the hallway, the baby tucked against her chest. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, her face pale and worn, but her steps were purposeful. "We have to go," she said softly. Nathan looked at her. He knew it already, but hearing her say it still hit like a gut punch. He stood slowly, stretching his stiff legs. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that. I can't put you in danger," she added. "You helped us. That's enough." He tilted his head, brow raised. "That sounds like a goodbye." Lena nodded once. "It is." Nathan crossed his arms. "Where would you even go?" She hesitated, rocking the baby gently. There's a transport that leaves in 2 days. Smugglers. They run evac missions for Volari families, if you can find them. If we reach them in time, we'll disappear. And if you don't, Lena didn't answer. She didn't have to. Nathan rubbed his face, the stubble on his jaw catching on his fingers. He paced for a second, muttering to himself, then stopped and looked her dead in the eyes. I'm coming with you. She blinked. What? I said I'm not letting you do this alone. Her brows pulled together, lips parting in disbelief. Nathan, this is suicide. You don't know what's out there. Yeah, I do. It's the same stuff that's been out there every damn day. The only difference is now I've got a reason to fight it. You don't even know me, she snapped. I know enough. She stared at him for a long moment, then looked down at the baby. Her voice dropped. You'd leave your life behind. For us. He gave a dry laugh. What life? You've seen it. Frozen dinners and 4 walls. That's not living. Lena exhaled, her grip on the baby tightening. I don't want you to die. Then we better not get caught. The corner of her mouth lifted, just barely. You're insane. Nathan smirked. That's what my ex used to say. They moved quickly after that. Nathan grabbed an old hiking pack from his closet, filling it with supplies. Cans of food, water, clothes, a flashlight, and an old revolver he hadn't touched in years. Lena moved like a soldier, efficient and precise. She packed light, essentials for the baby, a war knife strapped to her thigh, a small pouch of something she didn't explain. By dusk, they stood by the back door already. Lena turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. Once we step out, we don't stop. Nathan looked out into the snow-covered alley, his breath fogging the glass. Good, he said. I'm tired of standing still. And with that, they disappeared into the night together. The cold bit at their faces as they moved through the city's forgotten edges. Alleys no one used. Routes only people with something to hide knew. Nathan led the way, every sense on high alert. Lena followed close behind, the baby wrapped in thick blankets pressed tight against her chest. They didn't speak much. There wasn't time for conversation, only silent glances and quick nods when it was safe to move. By the second night, they'd reached the outer slums. Burned-out buildings and rusted fences lined the horizon. The launch point wasn't far now. The smuggler's ship would lift in just a few hours. But as they cut through a narrow corridor between 2 collapsed warehouses, Nathan's gut turned to ice. Footsteps. Multiple. Fast. He stopped cold, holding up a hand. Lena halted behind him, her breathing shallow. How many? She whispered. Nathan didn't answer. He was already reaching for the revolver tucked inside his coat. Then came a voice. Well, damn. You really thought you could slip away that easy. A man stepped out from the shadows, flanked by 2 others. His coat flared as he moved, and the unmistakable mark of the order glinted on his collar. Lena inhaled sharply. Jorik! The man grinned, wide and cruel. Hello, sister. Nathan's eyes widened. He glanced at her. Sister. Lena didn't look away from the man. Half-brother. Unfortunately. Jorik chuckled. You should have stayed in your cage. You knew they'd never let you walk. I wasn't going to raise my child in a prison. You think this is better? He stepped forward, dragging her through sewers and snowstorms. That's not freedom. That's desperation. She'll be free. Lena snapped. Even if I die, making sure of it. Jorik's smile faded. So be it. He reached for his weapon. Nathan fired first. The crack of the revolver echoed off the walls, and one of Jorik's men dropped. The second one dove behind cover. Jorik moved fast, too fast for a human, but Nathan was ready. He'd seen enough of Lena's kind to know they weren't easy to outrun. Lena ducked behind a crate, shielding the baby as Nathan fired again, grazing Jorik's shoulder. Jorik snarled, You're not even one of us. Why protect her? Nathan gritted his teeth. Because someone has to. He rushed forward, tackling Jorik to the ground. The 2 struggled, fists slamming against ribs and concrete. Jorik was stronger, but Nathan was relentless. With a final shout, He slammed the butt of the revolver into Jorik's temple. The man dropped unconscious. Nathan staggered to his feet, panting, blood on his lip. Lena emerged slowly, eyes wide, the baby unharmed. "You okay?" he asked, breathless. She nodded. "You didn't have to fight for me." He met her gaze. "I didn't fight for you," he said. "I fought for what's left of my humanity." They reached the launch point minutes later. A rusted freighter waited, engines low, lights dimmed. The smuggler took one look at Lena's mark and waved them aboard. As the ship lifted into the dark sky, Lena sat beside Nathan, the baby asleep between them. The stars stretched wide ahead, open, endless. She turned to him. "You could have let us go. You didn't have to follow." Nathan looked at the sleeping child. "She's not just yours anymore." Lena smiled, small and real. "Then you should know. Her name is Marin." He blinked. "You never told me." "I couldn't. Not until I trusted you." Nathan looked out the window, the glow of the earth fading behind them. "Well," he said, resting his hand gently on Marin's tiny back, "you can trust me now." And for the first time in a long time, they all slept safe, together, and finally free. Here is the story ends. If you enjoyed and want to watch more thrilling sci-fi adventures, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Dive into epic battles, explore distant galaxies, and join brave heroes as they fight for survival against impossible odds. Let us know in comments if you want next chapters to publish soon. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and become part of the journey. Together, we'll keep the last light burning. Subscribe now and let the adventure continue.